What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Typecasts. I haven't released a video in a couple weeks, and there's a couple good reasons for that. First of all, I've been publishing a few open source projects, and most importantly, last week was release week. So today I want to go over 5 tips that'll help you and your team have a successful application rollout. So like I said, last week was release week, and usually this can be a very stressful time, but luckily for us, it was not too much different from a regular week. So I think this is pretty awesome because our team is pretty small. It's only 5 or 6 developers, and our application didn't have the opportunity to do a slow rollout. We had to go from 0 to completely running in production day 1, which meant we went from serving 0 requests to about 250,000 requests a day. And luckily we didn't really have any major issues. I think we served maybe 5 actual exceptions. So to me, that's pretty incredible. I want to go over some of the reasons for that success and see how you can implement these techniques in your team and in your environments. So before I get into that, I would like to say we were afforded some luxuries. For instance, we have a team of very strong developers, and I'm very thankful for that. We also have leadership that is very trusting of us and letting us do the things that we need to do for our application. And then lastly, we were actually given the time that we needed to do the things that we wanted to do and the things that we felt we needed to do. Not every project gets these opportunities, so I'm really grateful that we actually had this time and this team to be able to get it done right. So the first thing I want to talk about is automation. And when I say automation, I mean CI/CD, I mean unit testing, I mean end-to-end testing. Whatever processes that your team may have that you can automate, do that as early as you can within reason. Unit testing and end-to-end testing is crucial. As your application grows, it's going to get harder and harder to validate and test every piece of your application, so make sure you invest early. If you're using frameworks like I recommend, like Nest and Angular, you're going to be gifted some really good testing suites. So make sure that when you start your application, you're going to use these out of the box because they're going to make your life a lot easier. Another important facet of automation is CI/CD. Make sure that all of your artifacts are deployable strictly through your CI/CD platform. These artifacts should only be deployed when you merge to your main branch. Merges to main branch should only happen when you've passed the pull request. Pull request should only be approvable when you have a unit test suite that passes a threshold. I recommend 80%. And your code analysis tests pass with no security vulnerabilities or major bugs. So keeping these guards in place is going to make it a lot easier to keep your main branch clean of code issues and making sure that all of your test suites are still passing. So then possibly most importantly, make sure that on day 1, you're deploying to a production environment. I've seen applications crash and burn because they waited to the last month or sometimes the last week to try to deploy to a production environment. And they always inevitably run into either infrastructure issues or red tape where you're trying to get all the actual infrastructure you need. There's always something that happens when you wait too long to deploy to production. There's really no reason to wait. If you have an application you're replacing, deploy to a different URL. There's no reason to hold back when you have CI/CD automation at your fingertips, ready to deploy to whatever environment you need to deploy to. So secondly, user acceptance testing. And if you're not familiar, this is where the users actually use your app and make sure it does the thing it needs to do. If you work in waterfall, sometimes this is called the last step of the project, and please don't do that. You should always be user acceptance testing. You should always be pushing to a staging environment or something like that for users to actually try the application and see if it's fulfilling their needs in a way that makes sense. Set up reviews as frequently as possible within reason, and make sure that you're actually getting good feedback. If you're not getting a lot of feedback, it might mean they're not actually using the app thoroughly, which isn't going to help you when release comes out and it turns out it doesn't really do everything it needs to do. Screenshots and documentation are not good enough. They actually have to use the application to determine whether or not it's going to fulfill their needs the way it needs to. Make sure they're actually using your tool. If you're using CI/CD, this should not be a big deal. It should automatically be deploying to a staging-like environment for them to use, and it shouldn't really be any burden for you or your team to deploy to an environment like this for users to actually test the application. So next is scalable infrastructure and making sure that your application's infrastructure can actually expand to meet the requirements of the application. So if you're deploying a small app, don't go overboard with things like elastic load balancers or things like that. You might not need it. But if you're building a big application, you probably do. So what I typically recommend for an API-driven web application is using the serverless methodology. So like I said, we were able to scale to 250,000 requests in a day, and we were able to do this because the serverless model just makes it so easy to do so. If you're not familiar with serverless, the general premise is that you're no longer caring about your infrastructure, you care about your code. You ship up your code to your cloud provider, and they make sure that you have a server that is going to actually execute the code and then spin down whenever it's done. Like I said, we were able to handle a lot of requests. So for us, the serverless model worked fantastically. Not all applications are going to be conducive to this, so make sure that your application makes sense on a serverless model, but ultimately it can be a really great option for you. So in a similar vein, you need to load test your bottlenecks. So this can typically be a database, it can be a file system, and it can be a third-party vendor, anything like that. So for databases, you should have a staging environment with the same amount of data you expect to have in production already seeded in your staging environment database. So this can be mock data. If you expect 1 million rows of data, make sure you're filling out 1 million rows of mock data and make sure it's all relatively the same to what you expect to see in production. If you don't do this, you're likely to run into a lot of issues with your queries, such as search-related queries or more complex queries like that. And by the time you release, it's going to be too late to find these bottlenecks to really do the things you need to do to make sure that it's as performant as possible. Typically, I recommend for these complex queries setting up an end-to-end or integration test that actually will check to see whether or not the query still runs underneath a expected threshold. So 500 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds, anything like that. Make sure as your application grows, you're not going to sacrifice your actual responsiveness in the process. So you also want to test your third-party vendors. So if you have third-party APIs that you're reaching out to or pulling data from, you need to make sure that it's going to be able to handle the scale of the sheer amount of requests or the size of the requests coming or going to that service. So for instance, if you expect to send 500 requests a minute, make sure it can handle 600. Make sure that the size of your payloads, if they're 5 megabytes on average, try 10. Make sure that no matter what you do, you're going outside of the expected realms of what your application is going to do, and that it can handle these scenarios either gracefully or successfully. If you're finding you can't get this third-party API to do the things it needs to do responsively, you can always use tools like queues and buses to actually throttle your requests going out or coming in from that API. And again, if you wait too long and try to test this in production, it's probably going to be too late, and you might have to do more hacky things to make it work. But if you catch this early enough, you can actually build really strong, resilient infrastructure to make those requests as seamlessly and painlessly as possible. So the last thing I want to talk about is application monitoring. And I don't just mean back-end server monitoring, but also doing things to manage the client-side errors. One of the best things about our application release is that we're able to watch our server and our client logs to see errors in real time before they could even report them. So whether there was a server sending out a 500 error due to some sort of unexpected payload, or there was an empty object on the front end, and so we got a null reference exception and the whole application stopped working on that page. We are able to find these kinds of things immediately before they could report them and get it fixed out within 30 minutes to an hour. And with CI/CD, making sure that all of our test suites run and making sure we're pushing to all the lower environments for testing and validation, we could get a fix in production within hours. And that's pretty outstanding, especially considering no one was even reporting these errors. We were finding them proactively and actually getting updates to our users before their frustrations would grow. So this type of monitoring can be really powerful, and it's going to make your clients really happy, because now every time they come to you with an error, you already know what's going on. So whether it's a server returning a bad response or whether it's your front-end application not handling it appropriately, you're able to get really good insights into what's going on and be proactive in helping your client get the application working the way they need it to work. So if you're using serverless technologies like I recommend, on AWS, you're going to have an excellent tool known as X-Ray. On Azure, it's called Application Insights, and on Google, it's referred to as Cloud Debugger. All these tools kind of do the same thing. They're going to give you insights into your API layer and into your processing layer to tell you what's happening throughout this request. So if you're using serverless tools like I recommend, with AWS, you're going to get X-Ray. With Azure, you'll get Application Insights. And Google Cloud, you'll get the Cloud Debugger. All these tools essentially do the same thing. They're going to give you insights to what's happening at the API layer as well as the processing layer. And using these timestamps, you can actually dive into the processing information and figure out what the true exception was very quickly, very easily, very painlessly. But just as important as the server side these days, the front end. And if you're not tracking your user exceptions, you're going to be missing a lot of information that's going to be really valuable in tracking down these errors. So there's a ton of services for this, Rollbar and Sentry being some of the bigger ones, but you can always just spin up your own client handling error API. And for instance, with an Angular application, you can have a global exception handler that just shoots up the payload of the stack trace and then logs it to CloudWatch for you to review later. So instead of having to pay for a service, Just spin up a serverless API and you already have essentially a free client handling API. If you have mission critical processes, I recommend using tools like PagerDuty or OpsGenie, because with these you can actually integrate with mobile applications and push notification alerts whenever a system goes down, or if there's a major processing error or anything like that. You can actually let your team know immediately whenever something goes down. So those are my 5 tips. Like I said, my team was afforded many luxuries, but using these techniques, we're able to have a very successful application rollout, and I hope you and your team can leverage them to have the same success on your applications. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.